Hello and welcome to another episode of the SEO Unplugged podcast. I'm your host, Itamar Blauer. Today, I'm joined with Jono Alderson, who's an independent technical SEO consultant. Jono, great to see you. How's it going?
It is going very well, apart from the 10 minutes of audio problems we just had. But yeah, all good. Thanks for having me. What a treat.
No, it's absolute pleasure. And so we're not going to be talking about technical difficulties today. We're going to be talking about technical SEO best practices. So, as somebody who has conducted so many types of technical SEO audits, worked through technical SEO performance in general, what are some of the things that you commonly find with websites in terms of what they get wrong with their technical SEO?
Yeah, super interesting. I think what they get wrong is quite often not so much, well, I was going to say not so much the actual technical stuff. They do, like most sites are a tire fire. But what's happening underneath that is I think most organizations and most SEOs kind of consider technical SEO in the wrong way. We've kind of normalized the idea that most websites are a bit rubbish and that they're like conventionally leaky buckets, that there's some degree of equity loss, etc. I think there's an opportunity for like the more sophisticated and the winning brands to go, actually, instead of treating tech SEO as some kind of debt and cost center, actually, what if we just make if what if we get really good at this and we make sure that instead of the state of our website being a performance detractor, that it becomes a performance multiplier. And if we say, actually, we invest in making sure that our code base is rock solid, that our stuff is lightning fast, that we're super efficient, that we're taking advantage of all these shiny new standards and capabilities, then instead of everything we do and every link we get and every campaign we run running at 80%, it runs at 150%. And then those brands steam ahead and they're faster and they're more agile, they have less technical debt, everything they do moves them forward. So yeah, I think the thing that everyone gets wrong is just seeing this as some kind of unpleasant housekeeping task that they have to do and therefore never really do very well, instead of seeing it as an opportunity.
Right. And have you found within that any commonalities in terms of specific areas that you sort of tend to over and over again tell people to improve? And obviously, I'm not necessarily saying this in terms of a checklist, but has there been anything that you've sort of seen across the board that can be quite detrimental that you sort of pick on and try and at least, advise people to sort out? Is there any particular thing or things that usually come about?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch, and it's typically the absolute basics. So I see time and time again all sorts of weird and wonderful or just completely missing configurations for controls for things like um, what types of pages and content should Google be able to crawl and what should they be able to index. There is nothing more basic than this for SEO, right? Like step one is communicate with search engines. What do I want you to come and read and evaluate and rank, and what don't I? And people still massively overlook the basics of this. So I see things like malformed meta robots tags where they're using putting instructions that don't make sense, or they're no indexing things that should be indexed, or they're indexing things that shouldn't be, or they've set up some kind of implementation with just the basics across the board and they're not tailored it. So they end up with all sorts of pages that really, if they took a step back and looked at it and said, does it make sense for a search engine to consume this and to index it? The answer is quite obviously no. Um, but they've still never configured it to manage that. And then similarly, things like XML sitemaps. I think it I find it profoundly baffling that many sites still aren't in a position where they can say, here is a comprehensive list of all of the URLs that I care about and which I think should be in a search engine. Like creating that inventory and managing that inventory actively feels like the kind of foundational work you need to do in order to then go, okay, and here's how we're going to compete and differentiate. So many sites have missing URLs in their XML sitemaps. They have URLs that don't exist anymore. They have stuff that's out of date. They have stuff that's no index. They have stuff that canonicalizes elsewhere. They have stuff that redirects. They're still using things like priority and change frequency, which haven't been supported for about 100 years. People just aren't on top of these types of basics. And they're all, meanwhile, very invested in digital PR and brand building and flashy landing pages. But again, this kind of leaky bucket analogy comes back that some percentage of all the work they're doing is wasted because they're not communicating clearly with Google because these basics just aren't in place. Getting that right feels like a good starting place.
Right, and something that I would maybe make the claim is that a lot of people who have websites get maybe quite comfortable in the sense that they're thinking, "Oh, well, okay, I'm using a CMS. we're in an advanced age of technology and the internet. I'm using a CMS that should in theory be up to date, should in theory be doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but in many cases that's not quite the case. So who's actually at fault here? Would you say that it's more the complacency of the businesses not doing enough due diligence or upkeeping or proactiveness to make sure that they've got the right sort of technical foundations in place? Or is it actually the case of the hosts or the CMSs that they're using? What's the sort of biggest issue here?
That's a fascinating question. So I worked at Yoast for 5 years and kind of straddled that line and tried to work out the answer to that. Um, I think the complacency is the biggest part. I think there's only so much that hosts and CMSs and plugins and systems can do. So one of the things we did at Yoast was try to get as much right by default as possible, but that you don't have the context of the business. You don't know the priorities or strategy or budgets or which pages do what. You don't have the detail and the nuance. So there comes a point where you've got to do a handover where the plugin or the system or the CMS can get all the very basics right, but still a competent human needs to be able to say, actually, we should no index this page for whatever business logic, or we should configure this setting in this way and input this information. One of the things I found consistently in WordPress, in the work we did in Shopify, in the stuff we looked at Wix and others, is business owners just don't engage. Um, and I don't know whether it's complacency or they're just busy with other things or they have other priorities or they've not ever really been trained to consider that their websites need to be living, breathing, managed love for things, not something that you build and then just outsource management to an agency. So we'd find quite frequently, even now, I talk with a lot of very high-end SEO type consultant folks who've never logged into a WordPress and tinkered with the Yoast settings, for example. And they've got multi-million pound dollar clients doing huge campaign work, and they've never gone in and clicked, well, actually, we should configure this thing in this way. So there's this whole world of like just tailoring beyond the basics that nobody ever does, never mind the businesses themselves. So yeah, it feels like there's an education gap, a motivation gap, a capabilities gap, maybe. It's interesting, like the idea that these things need to be managed. I think we've never really taught people. Like for so long, websites were something that you outsourced to an agency. And now success really requires that you go, we're going to treat this like we would a brick and mortar store. We're going to clean it. We're going to maintain it. We're going to change the structure internally. We're going to train the staff. We're going to do all these things. You can't just leave it, not if you want to win.
Sure. And I think maybe some of that could be down to just the outlook of technical SEO. It's not the sexiest thing within the marketing space, right? So it's
Yep.
like it could just be the perception of like, well, this just looks a bit boring, therefore I'm going to focus on XYZ. But the thing that sort of underpins the entire ecosystem is that technical side, especially for websites. So fundamentally, trying to make sure that you're having the right pages that can be found, can be crawled, can be rendered, can be indexed correctly by search engines. Otherwise, where's your presence going to come from? Otherwise, you're sort of just banking on direct traffic and no one will be able to sort of find you if they look for you, right?
Yeah, and
So
even more so. I'm sorry. Yeah.
no, go ahead, mate.
Even more so in a kind of this emerging age of AI and such generative experience and synthesized results we have, all of that stuff comes from somewhere. And the technical integrity of your platform is going to be a factor in how easily do these third-party systems discover, consume, evaluate your content. So yeah, if your HTML's a steaming pile of something or other, then those systems are less likely to be able to easily extract and summarize and synthesize stuff about you, your brand, your products than if you had something streamlined and lightning fast and easy to integrate with and so on. So yeah, it's not just about um, kind of building those strong foundations for today's conventional SEO. It's about being fit to exist in whatever this new world becomes.
Right. And I guess in some cases, we aren't able to accurately predict what that is. So, in the sort of world we're living in at the moment, when it comes to technical SEO and when we think of best practices, because some people will say, for example, okay, you need to ensure that the head section of your website is sort of rearranged or structured in a particular way where you've got your meta chart set here and you've got title here and all this sort of stuff. So, in terms of where we are at the moment, what have you found to be the more effective things that a site can do? And obviously, I know this is a very hypothetical question because every website is different. But are there any things that, in terms of if you were to recommend specific types of things for people to go in and action and be proactive and make sure X, Y, and Z works, what would that kind of look like?
It still very much looks like getting the foundations right. So you mentioned, for example, you touched on rendering just now and organizing heads, layouts, and things. I think there's an awful lot of developers and IT type folks who don't necessarily have a great grasp of the fundamentals of just building good websites, never mind the SEO side. So much of technical SEO is don't do stupid stuff with JavaScript. Don't do stupid stuff with conditional GR redirects. Don't do stupid stuff that breaks the HTML standards for what types of things you can and can't put in the head of a document. Don't do stupid stuff with loading 5 MB images. Like, beyond just build a decent website, there isn't much left of technical SEO nowadays. Like, yeah, okay, XML sitemaps are a thing, canonical URLs are a thing, hreflangs are a thing, but there aren't many distinct specs and parts of technical SEO that aren't just solid web standards. And I really like that, right? So much of what this becomes isn't technical SEO, it's just quality, and it's just adhesion to best practice. And all of that is very well documented, all of it is very well defined. And the biggest gap then is an education challenge. And so much of what I spend my time doing in the technical SEO world is looking at people's websites and saying that image markup isn't sensible. It's not consistent with the best practice. It doesn't meet these standards. Here's what the HTML definitions and guidelines say. Here's some emerging standards. Point to a reference, go and make it sensible. And very rarely is it inventing and constructing complicated magical solutions to things. It's just getting the basics right at scale.
Right. And I suppose part of the education point that you brought up is, I would say, quite relevant because you do find a lot within the SEO space and this industry where people will try to essentially quantify the importance of an individual action. So
Yeah.
people will say, for example, okay, you should focus and prioritize this type of action over this one because you will get better results, quote unquote, by doing that. Like, what's your take in terms of how that is, or at least the quantifying of particular technical SEO practices or actions? What do you make of that?
It's super tricky and it varies very much site to site and scenario to scenario. So if I'm going to be working with a client, there has to be some degree of prioritization because there's always going to be more than they can do, and some of those things are going to be more costly or expensive than others. So they have to be put in some kind of sensible order. Typically, I'll evaluate their current performance, look at data sources like Google Search Console, what sorts of things they're ranking for, crawl the site, spot any obvious challenges, and then with a little bit of experience and a little bit of guesstimation, and some kind of feel for how bad are the problems in these different types of areas, try and say, okay, I think this thing should be a 10-minute fix, and that's going to be twice as impactful as this thing that's an hour-long fix. This is an obvious easy win, but it's going to be super hard to put any specific metrics against that. It's definitely going to be impossible to say, if you fix this, you will rank 3 places higher. Just, yeah, there's so many moving parts here. I find Google Search Console is quite a nice thing for this, and then crawl logs as well. You can at least say, look, there is an obvious problem here where Google is struggling or lost or indexing things it shouldn't be or not indexing the things it should be, or it's slow to get. All these kinds of things are quite obvious to spot from the various symptoms and reports. And then you can, to a degree, say, okay, if we fix these 5 things, I think I would expect to see a significant reduction or increase in these particular metrics or toolings. And then, yeah, you hope that you can convince people that those should correlate to some kind of revenue at the back end.
Right. And I suppose that you mentioned there about tools. So Google Search Console being a good example in terms of a tool that's helpful, at least for people to get an idea in terms of what Google is seeing. But that's sort of like Google proprietary tools. So what about other SEO tools and crawlers and SEO tools that people use in general? What do you think in terms of their performance or the accuracy that they make in terms of identifying technical SEO issues or opportunities, and where do you think they can go? Like, do you think they're in a good place? What would you like to see?
I get really frustrated with a lot of those tools. So I use, if I'm kind of in that first point of evaluating a site, I'll use, and in fact, let me take a step back before I go into what I use. I think there's some key challenges with these tools. So anything that's looking at performance, rankings, traffic, etc., is doing some kind of proprietary calculations and making up some kind of metrics on visibility, domain authority, etc. all of those kinds of metrics are, we all know, very, very flawed in lots of different ways and very limited based on the size and nature of that tool's index, based on what they're calculating and what they're not, based on how they're managing spam, et cetera, et cetera. So those things are tricky. They're only ever useful as a kind of benchmark in terms of the delta between you and your competitors. But even then, directionally over time, that's going to vary. So they're useful at a kind of glance to get a feel for what is the order of magnitude of the gap, but it's not anything I want to be tying to business metrics. I find from the tech SEO side, a lot of these tools aren't hugely helpful. So they'll do things like say, we've called this site and we found 4,304 errors. And actually what happens is it turns out that I have 4,300 pages on my site, but there's a broken link in the footer. So it looks like individual instances of all the, and there are so many examples of that sort of thing where they're just not intelligent enough to take a step back and say, we want to try and understand what this actual problem is rather than just page by page evaluating the symptoms. And that's the kind of difference between, one of the many differences between good technical SEO and bad technical SEO. There is no value in me just reading a tool and saying, you have 4,304 errors. Here's a spreadsheet, go and fix them all, which I see many SEO agencies do. Actually, you want somebody who can say, look, there's some malformed logic in the footer template that's outputting this invalid HTML code, and that's causing all of these broken links across the site. Here is where you should go and fix it and what good looks like. None of the tools are good for that. The only one I've seen that gets close is, I guess, Screaming Frog for like the raw scaled crawling of finding those kinds of symptoms. But then Sitebulb is quite nice for collating and grouping things by implied template and looking at stuff horizontally across multiple pages. But nobody's got there yet. Nothing I've seen is smart enough to say, let's try and understand the underlying problems rather than just giving you a list of symptomatic stuff. It's very, very rarely helpful.
Right. And I mean, the amount of times that I've had emails from clients who have sort of said to me, "Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
panicking.
worried." Yeah. It's not great because it also kind of undermines you in the sense that it's like,
Yes.
if that's the perception that people have, that they hire you to, rank their site and then they get all of these bits here and there that's saying, "Oh, panic stations, this is something that's really detrimental," then they might think that you're the problem and that you're not doing the right things, and that can really sway off that relationship there,
Yeah.
which is a problem.
And there's various flavors of that, right? So those tools don't necessarily employ the best SEOs in the world. So there'll be different opinions and stuff that's wrong. So for example, SEMrush is very opinionated about alt attributes on images. Because for whatever reason they think that's important for SEO. It may be, it may not be. But there are best practice says that there are definitely scenarios where you should omit an alt attribute entirely or include an empty one. So don't try and have descriptive information about the image. That's quite a lot of nuance that requires quite a lot of business context for what is this template, what's the role of the image, what's the relationship to the content. They're never going to understand that, so they just say missing alt attributes, and yeah, your client gets a bunch of emails saying we've got 1,000 missing alt attributes, and you look like an idiot, or at least now it's an inherently combative relationship, and you've got to say, well, actually, we need to defend against all this nonsense coming in. Search Console is really bad for that as well. They send like these really cryptic emails
Oh,
saying,
yes.
"Yeah, you have pages not being indexed because you've got redirects." I'm like, I know, I configured the redirects because they shouldn't. Yeah, but every single one that comes in, you're right. Like everyone's like, "Is this a problem?" And then because there's only like 8 of those reports and they're quite nuanced, clients I see tend to think like that's their to-do list. Like there's nothing outside of that. So if you bring out an external stuff and say, well, actually, you've got this crawling issue over here, because that isn't codified nicely and fitting into any of these tools reports, you've then got to do the extra work to say, well, this is important, even though Google Search Console doesn't have a wonky report for it. So yeah, they don't make it easy. Tools are frustrating.
Yeah, no, I can hear that. And I guess because you mentioned there is nuance, so that like each case is different. So there will be instances where something may be more or less important within the context of that particular site and what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah,
So I suppose my question to you, and this is something where we can sort of round it up, is how would you approach in terms of the communication around technical SEO to clients or to people who have websites in general and sort of say, for technical SEO to be successful, you need to do fundamentally XYZ. Well, how would you answer that?
interesting. So I tend to approach that kind of auditing and communication. We start with that inventorying process. So if you're not in a position where you have a cohesive plan for what are all the URLs that I care about, and am I managing their crawling, indexing, rendering, then there's not a huge amount of point in talking about anything else, because all of the stuff that layers on top of that is going to be broke. I mean, obviously some of this stuff can happen in parallel and there's more moving parts, but ideally you want to focus on foundation first. And then everything after that is essentially just quality. It's, can we make this faster? Can we make this better? Can we make this clearer? And with some degree of guesstimation and prioritization over, okay, we think that we'll do this one first because that ties back to whatever KPIs we have or wherever the biggest fires we see are. But yeah, the foundational stuff is most of the work for most of the companies I see, and realistically, many of them never get all the way through that. There's like companies who haven't got that stuff sorted yet, regardless of size and resourcing, it's hugely difficult to get to the point where you transform an existing site and say, okay, now this is clean, now we build on it. And those are the kinds of things that generate instant returns. Like if Google is struggling to index the right kind of stuff, then every step you make in that direction is going to have an impact on the bottom line.
Sure. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think, a lot of this stuff is nuanced case by case, but at least if you're doing the foundations correctly, then you are essentially put in a good position, or it's a good place to be at which point you can then optimize and try and think how much resource you might want to include to get whatever possible outcome you're trying to do. And I guess it's nothing that you can really generalize, I suppose, because it is going to always be different. But because there are so many nuances, so many things to talk about when it comes to technical SEO. Jono, if anyone who's listening now wants to get in touch and ask you some questions, where can they find you?
At Jono Alderson on Twitter or at jonoalderson.com in your URL bar. Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. One more thought, actually, if I might. I think something we didn't touch on, which I think is also interesting, is the boundaries of technical SEO are increasingly blurry. And this is one of the key challenges, is now we seem to own performance, which is great, super fun, but also a field in its entire own right. We also now own analytics and security and accessibility, and broadly more now user experience, because it's the kind of sum of all of those things. So I think whilst you're right that it's not particularly sexy as a field, and it is a bit, oh, I've got to do my homework, I think it's going to become increasingly important and unavoidably so, because it's the bit that ties together all of these other fields. And you can't have a fast site if you haven't also sorted out the basics. And your site probably isn't accessible if it's a JavaScript monstrosity that also fails tech SEO requirements, etc. So yeah, I see this as a kind of increasingly central part of SEO and brought it into kind of just website management and quality control. So yeah, super excited about the future of this.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, yeah, bundling everything that you're saying under performance is something that I would assume will become an important buzzword, I guess, for businesses who are like, okay,
Yeah.
what's the performance of our site and how does this all tie in? So yeah, it will be really interesting to see what happens in the future. And obviously, you'll be sort of having a pulse on what's going on and sharing your thoughts, which are always great to engage with. So, Jono, thank you so much for your time. And for everyone listening out there as well, we will catch you in the next one. Hey, you've reached the end of this video, but don't worry, there's plenty more great content that you can watch right now. All you have to do is click one of the two video links on the left side of the screen. And also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to never miss out on future uploads.